Good evening. My name is Jillian Kintai, and I am also a student with the University of Washington's ENGAGE program. I will be talking about the relationship between male circumcision and syphilis prevention next Monday, April 27th at 6 p.m. As a graduate student, I get a really specialized kind of training in a very specific area of research. The ENGAGE program gave me another kind of training that graduate students rarely get. I learned how to talk about my research in a way that is engaging, enlightening, and informative. You can learn more about our innovative program at engage-science.com. And now to our second guest. Ashely Mihle is a graduate student, a newly graduated graduate student, almost, in the School of Environment and Forest Science and the Evans School of Public Affairs. She looks at how roadblocks such as water usage, climate change, and water policy challenge the development of biofuels. Let's give a warm welcome to Ashely Mihle.
Thank you, Jillian. Like Jillian said, my name is Ashely Mihle. I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington at the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences and the Evans School of Public Affairs. And like Jillian said, I successfully defended my thesis today, so I'm feeling pretty good. So I'm going to talk to you today about the blue cost of green energy. And by blue cost, what I'm talking about is water, and how much water it takes to produce biofuels. And yeah, green energy, I mean biofuels. So today, here's what I'm going to talk to you guys about. I'm going to talk to you about the global energy crisis and how fossil fuels are contributing to global warming and how they're not renewable. And this is not a long-term sustainable solution for our energy future. I'm also going to talk to you about why biofuels are a better alternative and why those biofuels are considered green energy. Next, I'm going to talk to you about the problem with biofuels, namely that they use a lot of water. Then I'm going to discuss how climate change can introduce uncertainty into this process and maybe make this problem worse. And then how biofuels policies, like renewable energy policies, are not in alignment with water policies, and how this complex policy landscape is something that needs to be looked at. So, what are biofuels? When someone hears the term biofuel, you may think about your hippie uncle who's making biodiesel in his backyard shed from used vegetable oil. But like Kelly said, biofuels can be made from a variety of plant matters. They can make a variety of fuels, and you use a variety of processes to do this. My research looks at hybrid poplar, and it uses it to make ethanol. So hybrid poplar is a common deciduous tree in the United States. It means that it loses its leaves in the winter and grows mainly during the spring and summer. Other species that are considered poplars are aspen, cottonwood, and birch, and my research looks at hybrids of mainly cottonwood species. So hybrid poplar, why is this being used for a bioenergy crop? Well, it's very fast growing. It can grow on lands that aren't suitable for things like food crop or grazing. It's very tolerant of low soil quality and low water quality as well. And it's very fast growing, and it's grown as a short rotation coppice. So what this means is the trees grow until they're about this tall, and then they're cut down at the stump and sent to the biorefinery to make fuel. And then they re-sprout from that same stump, and you can repeat this cycle over and over again before you have to replant the trees. So it's a pretty efficient way to quickly grow bioenergy crops. So here's how you make a biofuel. You take your plant matter, in my case hybrid poplar trees, and you chip them into wood chips. These chips are sent to the biorefinery, and then they undergo a treatment because this is a second-generation biofuel, so it has something called lignin, which is the woody part of the plant that has to be removed so you can access the sugars. So the lignin is taken out, and then you break up the cellulose molecule, like Kelly mentioned, to get the glucose, which is the sugar, and then you ferment it into ethanol. So why are we considering biofuels? Well, fossil fuels currently make up the majority of our energy portfolio in the United States. They're a fuel like coal, oil, or natural gas, and they're non-renewable. So I'm from Texas, where the oil and gas industry basically runs everything. All of these companies either have their headquarters in Texas or major offices there. So if we're using so many fossil fuels and they make up the majority of our energy portfolio, why are we trying to find a better alternative? Well, fossil fuels are not good for us. Like Kelly said, they're contributing to global warming and they're not renewable. So basically, fossil fuels are destroying our planet. So how do fossil fuels cause global warming? Basically, when the sun is sending energy to the Earth, and most of this energy is reflected back through the atmosphere and into space. But some of it is trapped from greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide. And the more greenhouse gases we emit, so the more carbon dioxide that's emitted from burning fossil fuels, the more the heat is trapped and the hotter the Earth gets. This is kind of like microwaving microwave food. So the microwave is sending more and more energy into the food, and the food is getting hotter and hotter because the heat is trapped by the plastic covering. And all you have to do to cool off your food is to peel back that plastic covering. But you can't peel back the layer of greenhouse gases. So the more carbon dioxide we burn, the hotter the Earth gets, and the more this becomes a problem that we can't solve. So why are biofuels a better alternative? Well, biofuels release carbon dioxide when they're burned, like any fuel. But the plant matter stores carbon dioxide when it grows, and this makes biofuels carbon neutral. In addition, biofuels are renewable. You can cut down the plant, you can grow it again, and you always have more plants for bioenergy. So biofuels sound great so far, so what is the problem? Here is a little context. All energy requires water. This is called the water-energy nexus. Water is required for the production, extraction, and transportation of energy, just like energy is required to extract, treat, transport, and use water. If global energy consumption increases, as it's projected to do, then water consumption will increase by almost double that amount. And this could put pressure on finite water resources, especially in areas with water scarcity. Water and energy are required at all phases of biofuel production. Water is used during the feedstock production to grow the crop. It's also used to make the fuel at the biorefinery, and this produces biofuels and bioproducts. So all energy uses water, but some energy uses more or less water. In the case of this diagram, you can see wind and natural gas use, and really, I'm saying use, but I should say consume. So to define these terms, basically, water consumption means any water that you use and then is no longer available for any other uses. So you use it and you degrade it, or it's evaporated into the atmosphere, so it's no longer available for any other use. But you can also use water and put it back into the system, and then other people can use it again. So that's considered non-consumptive water use. I'm interested in how much water biofuels consume. So how much water they're using that's not available for other users. So this is energy, this is water consumption. And as you can see, wind and natural gas use very little, whereas crude oil uses a little more, hydropower uses a little more. And this is because hydropower is mostly non-consumptive use. All the water is going back into the system. So how much water does bioenergy use? Bioenergy uses a lot more water than all of these other energy sources combined. And I wanted to see if this was going to be a problem for the biofuels industry in Washington State. So I did something called a water footprint. I calculated how much water is required to produce a biofuel from hybrid poplar. So how much water is required to produce a certain amount of product, and this gives me something called a water footprint. There's 3 different kinds of water footprints. The first is the green water footprint. This is how much rain is required to produce the crop. The second is the blue water footprint. This is how much processed water is required at the biorefinery, and also how much irrigation water is required at the nursery. So the plants go to a nursery stage where they're grown into little plants that are then cut up and planted in the field. And so there's a little bit of irrigation at the nursery, although it's a small amount. The last water footprint is the gray water footprint. This is basically a measure of wastewater. And in my research, it's the agricultural runoff from growing the crop. So how much water is consumed when making biofuels? In growing the crop, this uses all 3 types of water. So it uses green, blue, and gray water. And as you can see, it uses more green water, a little bit of blue water, and then kind of a moderate amount of gray water. Next, making the fuel at the biorefinery. This uses only blue processed water. So it uses clean processed water that you have to have a year-round consistent supply in order for the biorefinery to continually operate. So even though it's a small amount, it's a consistent amount. And there's actually wastewater at the biorefinery as well, but I didn't analyze this in my research. So how much water do these two processes use relative to each other? Well, 99.5% of the water is used to actually grow the crop. What does this actually look like? Here is the processed water, and here is the water to grow the crop. So as you can see, growing the crop is really what is creating this water strain in terms of biofuel uses. So before we saw this diagram in terms of how bioenergy compares to other energy sources, I wanted to see how my crop and my fuel, hybrid poplar and ethanol, compare to this range. So the range for bioenergy is here, and it's a big range. And this is because there's a lot of different crops that you can use. They make a lot of different fuels, and they're grown in a variety of places. And since you're growing something, it matters where you're growing it. Different climates use different amounts of water and things like that. So here is hybrid poplar. As you can see, it's on the small end of the range. And this is because it's a relatively water efficient crop, and also because my sites had a beneficial climate for this crop, and they were rain fed. So what's going to happen to this with climate change? This looks actually pretty good. We can grow hybrid poplar, we have plenty of water. So is climate change going to create a problem? Well, currently in Washington state, what happens is that all of our water is reserved in the mountains as snowpack during the winter. We get snow, and then in the spring, the snow melts, and this water feeds our rivers and streams, which is then used for our drinking water to irrigate our crops and things like that. So with climate change, what happens is we get more rain and less snow in the winter, so there's less snowpack, kind of like the winter we just had. And then in the spring, there's no snow to melt, and there's less water available in our systems in the dry months during the summer. And unless we make up this deficit with increased reservoir storage, we could experience water scarcity even in Washington state, especially in areas like eastern Washington, which are much drier than western Washington. So what happens to hybrid poplar with climate change? Well, I ran two climate change scenarios, both of them hotter, one with more precipitation and one with less. So first we'll talk about my wet scenario. So it gets hotter and wetter, but hybrid poplar has an ideal growing temperature, and it doesn't get hot enough in this scenario to heat stress the crop. So the crop yields are going to increase because it's warmer and it has plenty of water. So if crop yields increase, my water footprint stays about the same as my average climate scenario. So not much changes with climate change if it gets hotter and wetter. But if it gets hotter and drier, my crop yields go down because the crop gets water stressed. And basically the unmet crop water demand, because this crop is rain fed, it's not irrigated. So in the summer when it gets really dry, there's periods of water stress that are occurring already. And they're not a lot right now and not enough to really impact the productivity and yields of the crop. But if this increases by 300%, as it did in my climate change scenario, then this could significantly create significant water stress for the crop. And that means that crop yields are going to go down and my water footprint would go up. So water and energy policies. We learned that water and energy are connected, but where are water and energy policies? Here are how our current national energy and water policies are made, totally separately. And here's kind of where they need to be in order to encourage this industry. We have renewable fuel policies which have mandates and are encouraging this industry, yet we have water policies that are basically going to constrain the industry. And this is true not just of water and energy policies, but of land use policies and all kinds of other things. So the policy landscape for biofuels is actually very, very complex. And it's also site specific. So you have certain counties or certain cities or certain states that encourage or constrain this industry in different ways. And so all of these things need to be considered when trying to meet these mandates. So lastly, I'm going to sum up what we talked about today and what we can do about it. So fossil fuels are non-renewable and are contributing to global warming, and we need to find an alternative. Biofuels are one possible alternative that don't contribute to global warming in the same way, but they use a lot of water. And even though hybrid poplar uses less water than their range, it still is using a lot of water to grow that crop. And you have to find land to grow that crop. Even if it's marginal land, there's all kinds of issues with land use that might come into play here. So climate change introduces uncertainty into this. So perhaps it will definitely get hotter, but is it going to get wetter? Is it going to get drier? It really depends on where you are. And the precipitation models for climate change are not as accurate when they're downscaled as they could be right now. So basically, they're more accurate on a global scale, but when you downscale them to a small, like a state, and are trying to run a climate scenario, there's a lot of uncertainty there as well. So climate change itself is uncertain, and then what we know about what will happen with climate change is also uncertain, especially with precipitation. So that's something to think about in terms of where you're siting your feedstock, because you want to put your crop in a place that it can grow in 50 years, not in a place that it's only going to be able to grow for 10 more years. And then lastly, the water policy landscape is complex. So all of these energy policies are not in alignment with a lot of our other policies, and this could really pose a constraint for biofuels in Washington state. So what can we do about this? Basically, considering water consumption is something that really needs to be an area of more research in the biofuels industry. We're often talking about how much carbon dioxide is emitted, how they're carbon neutral, what their global warming potential is, but no one's really looking at water use, and no one's looking at land use change. There's a lot of factors that some people are looking at, but that need a little bit more attention. But after doing that, we can use the best crop that is the most water efficient, and we can put it in the best place that's rain-fed, that's most well-suited for that crop. We can use the best process to make the fuel. So the higher conversion yields we have, the more efficient processes we have, the more technological and engineering improvements we make in this process, basically the more efficient and more economically viable it becomes. And all of these things can lower our water footprint and make this issue less of a problem. So I would like to thank my thesis committee, especially Dr. Susan Bolton, Dr. Renata Burra, and Dr. Claire Ryan, who were just an amazing team of advisors and who I am extremely grateful for. The academic support provided by my lab, my family, friends, and loved ones, who are basically my emotional support network, the engaged science instructors and my classmates who taught me the skills I have learned here today. And then I would also like to thank the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which has made it possible for me to go to grad school and has funded this research. So that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, so you said that to separate the cellulose, you have to get rid of the wood somehow. What happens to the wood, and is water used in that process?
Okay, so I am not a biochemical engineer, but basically in plant matter, in a lignocellulosic plant, you have something called lignin, which is like some hard structure that you have to remove. And then you have hemicellulose and cellulose. And so basically you soak the wood chips in water because they're dried, so you get them wet again. And then my process has a dilute acid pretreatment, so it soaks it in sulfuric acid for, I don't know, a few hours, a day. I'm not totally sure. I'd have to ask my engineering lab friends. But, and then after it has the acid soak, that removes the lignin, I think. And then you do an enzymatic hydrolysis process to separate the cellulose molecules and get the sugars out, and then you ferment them. So it creates water is used in all of those processes. It's not used in separating the lignin because that's sulfuric acid, but it's used in hydrolysis and in the fermentation process. But it's actually a tiny, tiny amount. So for my water footprints were from like 400 to 1400 liters of water per liter of ethanol, and the conversion process uses 4 liters of water per liter of ethanol. So it's a tiny, tiny amount of water. And
waste from this process?
Yeah, so there could be. This biorefinery doesn't exist yet. So there's in the national Renewable Energy Laboratory has like a model and a report that most people are basing their research off of, and you can have a zero discharge system in which you don't create any wastewater discharge. You're doing like you're treating the wastewater, recycling it, and creating kind of like a sludge that can then be disposed of in somehow. And you can have like treatment ponds. Actually, I didn't look at this because there's not a lot of data on it, and you really need to do basically like modeling scenarios with all the different wastewater processes, and so that's a little more engineering than I was. But yeah, I can send you more information about how you separate the lignin and the hemicellulose. Like it's in my resources, but I don't have it memorized. Yes?
There are high-tech ways of getting fossil fuels now, like fracking.
Right.
That use a lot of water.
Right.
How do those methods compare with your method in terms of the consumption of water from renewable energy?
So I didn't, I didn't compare it directly to fracking. Fracking does use a lot of water, and in a different way, because you're creating some sort of wastewater stream that then you're usually injecting underground, but they won't release what's in that wastewater stream. So I think there's not a lot of knowledge about whether or not that water is a consumptive use or not. And then,
pretty clear.
well, to you and me, yes, but like from a science perspective, you gotta like look at all the chemicals in there and analyze it. And it does use a lot of water, but the amount of water required to actually like grow a plant is astronomically large. But maybe it's a different type of water. Like if you have a rain-fed crop, you're using a ton of water, but it's rainwater that would be growing plants anyway. It might not affect your hydrology of the system. Whereas if you are using you're withdrawing water from a water body, you're having to transport water across watershed boundaries or anything like that, you're having to take water from one place and move it to another. That's a different kind of water use, and that very well may pose a problem for that industry.
Hi, the seasonality of the water demand to the poplar.
Right. Okay, so poplar is a deciduous tree. We live in the Pacific Northwest, where our rain comes in the winter, which is why we have conifers. That's why. And so poplar doesn't use a lot of water in terms of like acre feet of water. So if you can site it in a place that has enough rain in the winter, like Western Washington, Idaho, there's some places in Oregon where the site suitability is pretty high. There's enough rain in the summer that it's fine for growing poplar trees. But yes, it is a deciduous tree and perhaps would be more well suited for maybe like the eastern half of the United States, where you have a lot more rain and deciduous trees do better.
Awesome talk, cheers. I was wondering if you have any metrics. For example, the other day I heard a walnut takes 40 gallons of water.
Okay.
So for like a gallon of this type of fuel, how many gallons of water? Maybe I missed that.
No, I didn't tell you because that is super detailed, but I can tell you. Okay, wait, I have this random stuff in the way. Okay, so here's cubic meters per bone dry ton of the crop. Do you want liters per liter of ethanol? Or do you want cubic meters per gigajoule of energy? I got all the things. Yeah, so I think liters per liter is the easiest thing. And the reason I have cubic meters per gigajoule of energy is because different energies have different amounts of the conversion to different fuels have different conversions to energy. So ethanol has less energy than say like gasoline. So you look at it in terms of gigajoules of energy, not liters of fuel, because a liter of ethanol may not give you as much energy as a liter of, diesel fuel or something. But for liters of water per liter of ethanol, this graph shouldn't.
No big difference.
Anyway, basically the rain-fed crop, I have an irrigated scenario, but that's not actually a proposed scenario. That was just for my climate modeling. But the rain-fed crop is Pilchuck, and so the average crop yield, it's 455 liters of water per liter of ethanol.
So on a spectrum of biofuel, I'd love to see that kind of like a impact.
And the reason that it's hard is that there's a lot of different methodologies for calculating this. A ton. You have to make a lot of assumptions, and everyone uses a different methodology and different data and different assumptions, so you end up with very different results. It's also highly dependent on the yields that you're using, and it varies with climate. So this is the footprint for a Western Washington site, but if you look at it for California, it's gigantic. So those metrics that you're seeing about like almonds are cool because they kind of let you know like, okay, this is a very water intensive crop. Maybe I should like think as a consumer about my choices, but that's a very approximate number.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi. I know you hate to speculate on things, but would you, if the crop you had chose to study were saltwater algae,
Right.
how would your talk differ from the one we heard?
I mean, I have no idea because I haven't studied saltwater algae. So, you know, it's very dependent on the crop you're looking at and the process and where you're putting it.
I understood your talk right. May not have. The green water, the blue water, the gray water. Mm-hmm. The green water dominated the...
Right.
But if it's salt water...
Well, that would be... I mean, ocean water just wasn't even in my scheme because this is fresh water. So this is all freshwater consumption. It's water. Will this create issues for water that has competing uses with, it's an anthropogenic, it's a human dominated calculation. Is this water scarcity going to create issues for our municipalities in terms of how much water they have in their reservoirs? Is this going to be competing with our food crops? Like those are the broad questions of why I would be looking at how much water this uses, whereas something in the ocean that's algae is a totally different question.
On us here, why isn't the conclusion of your talk that seawater algae is the best possible choice because it has no impact on green water?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of research going into algae in terms as a biofuel crop, and that may be the answer. I mean, that very well may be the answer. I mean, maybe we should scrap first and second generation fuels and go to algae or like something we haven't thought of yet. I mean, I think that's always a possibility. I think the point of this research is to see like this is something that's actually actively being proposed. Is this a good idea? How can we do it better? How can we make it work? What are the things we should think about when we're looking at this, and like why are we making these policies? And some biofuels are a great alternative, and I think we have to look at all of them so we can fully understand that.
Thank you.
No problem.